Good evening. I'm Selena Stazari, and welcome to yet another edition of ABC Storytellers, a program that strives to take a deep dive into the themes, literary devices, and overall intentions of great Australian authors. Regular viewers of our program may notice that today's instalment is a little different. Due to coronavirus, our program will be broadcast via Zoom to ensure safe social distancing. Today on the show, I'll be speaking with author Nam Le. Nam and I will be speaking about his 2008 Dylan Thomas Prize-winning short story, The Boat. Nam, it's a pleasure to have you on the program.
Thanks, Selena. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, Nam, I want to get straight down to business with The Boat. Would you like to give the audience a brief rundown of its content?
Yeah, of course. Well, for all of you at home who haven't yet had a chance to read The Boat, it's centered around a self-named character, Nam Le, and his relationship with his father, Thang. Thang is a veteran of the Vietnam War who immigrated to Australia after the My Lai massacre, whilst his son, Nam, the protagonist, was born in Australia. Nam now lives in America as he further pursues his writing career, and at the beginning of the story, father and son reunite after a considerable amount of time spent away from each other, and we follow how this relationship evolves over the course of his father's story.
I have to say, after reading The Boat, I'm particularly interested in discussing how it presents notions of identity and belonging as challenging for immigrants managing their assimilation into Australian culture. Nam, would you say that The Boat explores this idea?
Indeed, I intended to address notions of immigrant identity and belonging as challenging, particularly between Eastern and Western societies. Their cultures and customs are so vastly different, and that leaves room for misinterpretation and misunderstanding between natives and immigrants. Furthermore, when these immigrants have children and these children grow up in a mix of two cultures, it can lead to feelings of confusion about who they are and who their people are. I chose to utilize intertextual references within my piece to portray how my protagonist, Nam's tumultuous relationship with his father, has formulated in an inability to identify with both Vietnamese and Australian culture.
So, Nam, I wanted to talk about the use of Thang's proverbs throughout the chapter. I got the impression that on many occasions when Nam and Thang share any moment of importance, Thang uses the Vietnamese proverbs to dehumanize the interaction. How does this relate to the inability to identify with both Australian and Vietnamese culture?
Well, if we look at the example on page 13, I write about the disconnection between father and son. Nam talks about how instead of personal phone calls from his father and being allowed to have a girlfriend, it was just proverbs and regulations. On another occasion, Nam talks about eating a durian fruit given to him by his mother. Nam begins to vomit up the fruit when his father says, "Doi an moi kun gon." Hunger finds no issue with food. Thang is the link to Vietnamese culture for Nam, and yet Thang denies the two a meaningful connection through the harshness of the proverb.
That's an interesting portrayal of the disconnection between Vietnamese culture. So, Nam, would you mind giving me an example of when your character is connected from Australian culture as well?
I'm glad you mentioned that, Selena. Nam also indicates a difficulty with this identification with Australian culture on page 13. Here, Thang is denying Nam his engagement with Australian culture through his disciplinarian ideology. Quote, "When I was in primary school, he made me draw up a daily 10-hour study timetable for the summer holidays and punished me when I deviated from it." This is just one of the many examples displaying how Nam's tumultuous relationship with his father has formulated an inability to identify with Vietnamese and Australian culture.
Oh, I feel so sorry for poor Nam being forced to eat fruit that makes him throw up. Would you say you're a fan of durian fruit?
No, I've always been a big pineapple man myself, to be honest.
Now fruit aside, I would like to touch on the imagery of Chairman Mao mentioned on page 3. So the text states that I threw some magazines over the roughest spots of the desk and then flipped one of them over because its cover bore a picture of Chairman Mao. So this small, seemingly meaningless sentence is charged with contextual historical meaning, as Mao was a Chinese symbol for communism, which had spread deep into Vietnam by the time of Thang's birth. So American protests against communism were a large driving force for their part in the Vietnam War, particularly the My Lai massacre, for which Thang was a part of in 1968. And so in turning over the image, Nam is showing sensitivity to any hang-ups that his father could have if he saw the image, as Nam, who has never been to Vietnam, cannot fully grasp the psychological damage that the Communist Party had on Vietnam. And this, I believe, is evidence of the cultural rift between Naarm and Thang that blurs the notions of identity and emphasizes Naarm's lack of identification with his ancestral culture.
An astute observation. The image of Chairman Mao is indeed representative of the disparity of culture between father and son. And I'm sure we can conclude that the above discussion highlights how Naarm's tumultuous relationship with his father has widened the gap in Naarm's ability to identify with Vietnamese and Australian culture.
Yeah, and even on a larger scale, how notions of identity and belonging are represented as challenging for the immigrants managing their assimilation into Australian culture. So, talking about assimilation, if we expand on this point, the text also conveys the idea that cultural assimilation is a constant process aimed at cultivating a sense of belonging within a new culture. We can use the characterization of your protagonist, Naarm, to explore how he seeks to cultivate this sense of belonging, given that his ability to identify with Vietnamese and Australian culture has been marred.
Selena, that's a great point about assimilation that you've raised there. Naarm embodies the idea that assimilation is a process of constant change by moving to the United States. Vietnamese and Australian culture hasn't exactly worked out for Naarm, so I wanted to represent the distance from the cultures by having Naarm move to Iowa in the United States.
And as I recall, Naarm worked as a lawyer in Melbourne before that.
Correct. On page 24, Naarm states, "I was a lawyer and I was no lawyer." I wanted to highlight Naarm's dissatisfaction with the occupation by highlighting how he had to wake up at the smoggiest time of day, wear clothes that chafed, and sit in a windowless office. He goes on to claim that he hated his job and hated how his father was only proud of him because of that job.
Yeah, with that example, I can understand Naarm's difficulty with cultural assimilation into Australia. So if we return to our previous discussion of Naarm's childhood and how his father would force him to study all day instead of going out with friends, I see how his father being proud of his lawyer job would really irk Naarm. You know, going into the city and getting a fancy, well-paying lawyer job is what his achievement-oriented father wanted for his son. However, in doing so, Naarm felt unable to cultivate the sense of belonging that he was seeking. He was prevented from assimilating into Australian culture due to his father's disallowing of cultural engagement. And he also couldn't connect with his Vietnamese heritage.
And after that, when Naarm moves to America to become a writer, he receives an opportunity to engage with his Vietnamese heritage as he and one of his American friends discuss the possibility of him writing a Vietnamese book, stating that you could totally exploit the Vietnamese thing and you could just write about Vietnamese boat people all the time. However, by this time, Naarm's lack of exposure to his father's culture has resulted in a reluctance to engage in said culture. I wanted to really hammer home how the text conveys the idea that cultural assimilation is a constant process aimed at cultivating a sense of belonging within a new culture by highlighting the final interaction with his father and what happened to the book Naarm had written based on his father's experience in the My Lai massacre.
Right, where it's implied that his father burns Naarm's Vietnamese story.
Well, as the author, I cannot confirm or deny whether that happened. But this incident is significant because Thang has just given Naarm permission to write about his My Lai Vietnamese story. If I had written the story in a direction in which Naarm had successfully included the massacre, it would have imbued in the reader a sense that Naarm had found identity. Since the book was lost, the reader comes to realize alongside Naarm that identity is never a concrete and assimilation is a constantly evolving process.
Very arbitrary. So now, after everything we've just discussed, I concur with full confidence that notions of identity and belonging in the boat are, for immigrants managing their assimilation into Australian culture, considered challenging. You've given clear intertextual evidence that portrays how Naarm's tumultuous relationship with his father has formulated an inability to identify with both Vietnamese and Australian culture. And I do feel that your last point about the text conveying the idea of cultural assimilation as a constant process aimed at cultivating a sense of belonging within a new culture has given me a deeper understanding of just how difficult it can be for immigrants in Australia. And lastly, Naarm, I wanted to thank you for being on the program. It was a pleasure speaking with you today.
The pleasure's all mine, Selena. Thank you.
And I hope we get to see you on the show again for your next book, whenever that may be. Well, that's all we have time for tonight. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you for the next episode of Storytellers. Again, thank you and good night.